Brazil wrapped up 2025 firmly in the lead as the world's top beef supplier, driven by record exports and historically high slaughter numbers. But looking ahead to 2026, the cattle market may be nearing a key turning point, one that could start to change supply, prices, and even global competitiveness. To look at what lies ahead for Brazilian beef, I'm joined today by Larissa Alvarez, StoneX's market intelligence analyst and the author of the upcoming quarterly livestock report set to be released on January 27th. Welcome, Larissa, and great to see you.
Hi, Johanna. Great to see you too, and happy 2026.
Yes, Happy New Year. I can't believe we haven't spoken yet. So let's start with this. Brazil ended 2025 as the world's largest beef supplier. What were the key factors that helped Brazil really cement that leadership?
Well, 2025 was really the year when Brazil consolidated a position it had been building for some time. The most obvious factor is scale, because Brazil delivered record export volumes and operated at historically high slaughter levels, which shows the industry's ability to respond quickly when global demand is there. But it's not just about volume. Brazil has some very clear competitive advantages, like a large and well-distributed herd, productivity gains over the past decade, and a cost structure that remains very competitive compared to other major exporters. That combination allowed Brazil not only to grow, but to grow consistently. And when we zoom out the global picture, the numbers are quite telling. Over the last 5 years, Brazil accounted for more than half of the net increase in global beef supply. That means that even though other producers also grew, Brazil was responsible for most of the additional meat available worldwide. At the same time, growth among other major exporters have been much more limited, whether because of environmental constraints, herd rebuilding, or higher production costs. That gap reinforced Brazil's leadership. Of course, there are points to watch going forward, like China still absorbs more than half of Brazilian exports, and the safeguard discussions earlier this year reminded the market that competitiveness and access conditions really matter. So leadership is strong, but it still needs to be managed carefully.
Now, in your report, you also highlight that global beef supply is expanding slowly and remains concentrated among few producers. How does this global backdrop amplify Brazil's strategic importance?
It amplifies it quite significantly. When global supply grows slowly and is concentrated in the hands of just a few exporters, every marginal ton becomes more available. And that's where Brazil really stands out. Because among surplus countries, Brazil is clearly in a league of its own. Just because it exports more than twice the volume of Australia, which is the second largest exporter, and far more than other South American suppliers like Argentina, Uruguay, or Paraguay. On the other side of the equation, we have the deficit countries, and China is the most striking example. China's annual beef import requirement is already above 3.5 million tons. Structurally, that tells us something very important. Even if Brazil redirected all of its exports exclusively to China, it still wouldn't fully cover Chinese demand. So what we're really looking at is a global market with a structural shortage of beef and very few countries capable of supplying large volumes consistently. In that context, Brazil's role goes beyond just another export. It becomes a stabilizing force for global supply.
And what about on the domestic front? Because the economy seems to be helping beef demand, but you also point out some risks in your report. What are they, and how do you see Brazil's domestic demand evolving in 2026?
Well, overall, the domestic backdrop is supportive, yes, because Brazil is growing, unemployment is at historically low levels, and whenever we see that combination, beef consumption usually responds positively, positively because beef is still a central protein in the Brazilian diet, especially when income and employment are stable. But domestic demand is supported, but it's not immune to shocks. Like, one point of attention is households' finances, because the finance delinquency has been rising, which raises questions about how much of the available income will actually translate into consumption. And 2026 is also an election year. And in Brazil, election periods tends to bring some uncertainty, and that can influence consumer behavior, especially when it comes to discretionary spending. So, demand should remain firm, but maybe more selective. In short, the fundamentals are there for domestic consumption to grow, but the pace of that growth will depend on confidence, credit conditions, and how households manage their budgets.
Okay. There were also some unexpected disruptions last year. Sanitary issues, for example, especially the avian flu, were a big part of the story in 2025. How do events like that ripple through the beef market?
This is a great example of how interconnected the protein market really is, because when avian flu led to temporary suspensions of chicken exports, a much larger volume of poultry stayed in the domestic market, and that extra supply pushed chicken prices down quite sharply. And when one protein became significantly cheaper, consumers naturally substitute. So even though beef demand itself didn't collapse, beef prices felt indirect pressure because chicken became more competitive. So the key lesson here is that sanitary shocks don't affect just one protein. They ripple through the entire meat complex. Relative prices matter just as much as absolute demand. So even a localized or temporary health issue can influence consumption patterns and prices across beef, poultry, and pork too.
Okay. And your report also suggests that supply could be the biggest question mark for 2026, and that Brazil could actually be at a turning point in the cattle cycle. What does that mean for the year ahead?
Yes, the supply is really the big question mark for this 2026. Because in 2025, Brazil operated at exceptionally high slaughter levels, close to 3 million head per month on average, and even reaching 3.6 million into the third quarter. And that's unprecedented. A big part of that expansion came from higher female slaughter, because when margins are good and supply is abundant, producers tend to send more females to slaughter. But that strategy has a natural limit, because females are the foundation of herd replacement. So what's interesting here is, in the recent months, we've started to see a decline in female slaughter. So that's often an early signal that producers are beginning to retain animals again, rebuilding the herd. Because the cattle cycle is long, we used to say that anywhere from 18 to 30 months from birth to slaughter, any decision made now will affect supply into the future. That's why the first quarter of 2026 will be crucial. It will tell us whether the cycle shift is confirmed after the breeding season. If the turning point is indeed underway, we could be entering a phase of tighter supply just as demand remains strong, and this probably will create a much more supportive price environment.
That's really interesting. Larissa, thank you so much for all your valuable insight. And thank you to our viewers for watching. For deeper insights and analysis, scan the QR code or click the link in the description to download StoneX's Market Intelligence Quarterly Report.